All right, welcome everybody to the 2022 Northeast Ohio Pollinator Symposium Winter Series. I'll share a little bit of information at the end of the program about maybe a summer series that is in the works that we are going to be announcing during this webinar series. But right now, let's focus on our winter series, our online Zoom presentations. So I mentioned it before, but I would like to reiterate, this is a program, a collaborative program between the between the Ashtabula County Beekeepers Association, the Ohio State Master Gardener Volunteers of Ashtabula County, the Ashtabula County Soil and Water Conservation District, the Ashtabula County Metro Parks, and the Ohio State Extension Office in Ashtabula County. My name is Andrew. You probably got an email from me reminding you of this event. So if you have questions, you can send them my way, especially on the technical side. But I am the natural resource educator at the Ohio State Extension Office in Jefferson in Ashtabula County. And I'm also the Master Gardener Coordinator for Ashtabula County. I'd like to thank all of our partnering groups that have helped make this possible and helped grow it to where it is now. We're excited to bring you this 5-part series here again. So we'll move the slides along. Just want to mention this is a 5-part series. This is the first part. We thank you for joining. We hope you continue to join us for the next couple presentations. Next one is going to be in 2 weeks from now. Same time, same place, same link. January 26th at 7 p.m. And the title for that is Creating a Heaven for Pollinators, including butterflies, bees, and hummingbirds. And that is going to be presented by Denise Ellsworth, pollinator educator here at Ohio State University. So make sure you have your calendars marked for 2 weeks from now for that presentation. Another thing I wanted to mention is this is being recorded. So we will have the recordings for viewing at our website. If you haven't seen our website already, hopefully you went there to sign up for that. But if you go to our website, go, www.go.osu.edu/NEOPS, Northeast Ohio Pollinator Symposium. You can view all of our past recordings. So 2020 and 2021, we have, those older presentations there available to watch. And then as these go on, hopefully within about a week or so, we'll have them up and available. There'll be more information coming out via email about the recordings. You will receive an email tomorrow thanking you for attending with that link, and you can go to that website. The recording probably won't be up for this presentation, but if you know someone that missed it, let them know that these will be recorded and they will be online. We have a lot of people viewing them after the fact that maybe can't view them live. So we'll have that. Some of the presentations will be password protected. So you'll receive an email with that information as far as how to access it and with the password and such. So we thank you for viewing it live. And like I said, anyone that you know that wants to view it after the fact, just have them go to that link. This is what the website looks like. You'll see that there's 2 tabs there, 2020 and 2021. There will soon be a 2022 tab with all the recordings and additional resources, that sort of thing, handouts if there are any. And again, that's at go.osu.edu/Northeast Ohio Pollinator Symposium. So one quick mention, if you're not familiar with Zoom, I know a lot of us are after having to use Zoom here the last couple of years. But if you're not familiar with Zoom, this is a webinar. I can't see you and I can't hear you, which is good because that means we won't have any distractions with our presentation tonight. But it's bad because if you have some issue or a question, I can't hear you, ask it. You don't have to worry about your background or what your camera looks like or anything like that. But I can only communicate with you, or you can only communicate with me through the chat box. So down at the bottom, if you see that big arrow, there is a Q&A box that you can click, and then there's a chat box that you can click. So if you have just something that you want to add to the conversation, you can use that chat box. If you have a specific question, use the Q&A box and we'll try to get it answered. Like I said, there's so many people on the night and we're so happy to have you all. We're probably not going to answer all the questions, unfortunately, just because of the sheer amount of people that are on, but we're going to give it a shot. So if you do have a specific question, feel free to put it in the Q&A box and we'll try and get an answer. You can let me know if you have any questions during the presentation. I'll try to get them answered as well, as far as technical questions about Zoom or anything like that. So hopefully everybody is comfortable with Zoom, and if you don't have any questions or you don't want to add anything, just sit back, relax, and watch the presentation. All right, so I didn't change the date on there, so I apologize for that. But today's presentation is going to be presented by Judy Semrock, and her presentation is going to be entitled Trees, Shrubs, and Vines to Attract Beneficial Insects and Birds. And I'm going to let Judy give her introduction of herself briefly, but that is going to be our excellent presentation for tonight, and again, it will be recorded. One last thing that I want to mention before handing it off to Judy is I'm sure some of you have joined us after watching the Western Reserve Land Conservancy Pollinator Symposium. And we're one of the couple presentation pollinator series that are happening this year. We're happy to see others putting on these great presentations and getting more information about pollinators out there. So I'm sure some of you have already attended one presentation today. So if that is the case, we're happy to see you here as well. The first one was today from 1 to 4, but it's my understanding that they are going to have a 5-session series, kind of like ours, in the afternoons as well. So if you want some more information on that, I am going to put it down in the chat box once Judy gets started. And Judy is a collaborator with that event as well. So I am going to ask her to maybe talk about it a little bit. But without further ado, I will give the mic over to Judy and let her get started, introduce herself, and maybe mention a little bit about the other pollinator symposium. Thanks, Judy.
Hi, Andrew. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening. For those of you that took part in the pollinator symposium that took place earlier today, I'm glad that you were able to join us. And there will be 4 more sessions coming up every 2 weeks. So if you had signed up for it, you will get a note with a link to the next one, and that will continue to go on. But we have had some great speakers already, and we will continue to have some in the future. I'm just going to go ahead and put my little picture down. So if you don't know me, I formerly had been a science teacher, a petroleum geologist, and for the last 20 plus years, I had been working for the Cleveland Museum of Natural History in the Natural Areas Division. And then earlier, or at the midpoint of last year, I started to work on my own as far as doing a lot of different ideas and projects, and I created a company called Nature Spark, and that's just getting up and running. But I'm going to continue to give programs like this and be a part of the nature education community here in Northeast Ohio. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully I can find it. Let's see here. There we go. And so the purpose of this program was to sort of give people some additional ideas of things that they could plant to attract a variety of nature to their yards and gardens. And some of these plants have some sort of maybe seen or unseen benefits. And so by trying to make it available to folks to learn about some other different species, maybe that they weren't aware of before or would like to try something different, keep in mind that all the species that I've mentioned, that I'll mention in the program, they are all at least native to the Midwestern part of the country. Most of them are all native to Ohio, but I've thrown some other ones in there that are more southerly occurring. And that's mainly because as our climate continues to change and we start to see more species that are moving north, both as insects, birds, plants, things like that, I think it's important for all of us to realize that we may start to see insects, for example, that need certain plant species, and those plant species aren't here because they're normally in a more southerly location. So it's just part of the education that I'd like to get out there for folks to just learn about and make some other decisions about what they can put in their yard. So for the trees, there's going to be, you can't talk about all of them, and there's just too much information as it is. So I'm hoping that I can keep within my time period. But the cherries, the oaks, the birches, those are all very, very good species that attract a lot of insects, both on their actual leaf material or cavities and things that attract nesting, things like that. But keep in mind that as we go through this, you'll see little numbers, and we'll show that coming up, but you'll see little numbers that'll be next to some of these species. And this goes along with, if you're familiar with Doug Tallamy, and I'm sure most of you are, a lot of the work that he has done about the number of species that are using various plant species, the number of insect species, Lepidoptera, mainly the butterflies and the moths that provide the caterpillar source that our birds need so vitally for either during migration or to feed their young. So I will have noted those numbers of how many different species that a particular plant or group of plants actually attracts or helps to draw in. In the shrubs, there'll be buttonbush, viburnums, elderberries. We're going to be talking about a lot of different things. And then for the vines, poison ivy, grapevines, native honeysuckles, and more. Hopefully you all can see the little creature there around, highlighted by the blue oval, and that is a great horned owl that is hiding in a grapevine complex, which is a very much of a favorite hiding place for them, especially during the day. So the criteria that I have sort of used to make the selections of the plants is, what is the draw, or how many species, or what does it offer to the birds, the insects, and the mammals mainly? Now, I've put in here woody plants that provide food in the form of berries, nuts, seeds, cones, catkins, acorns, nectar and pollen from flowers, sap, things like that. And then plant material for the larval stage of the species life cycle, which means caterpillars, both moth and butterfly caterpillars, because if you don't really think about that, you need to, because that's really what is providing the food for our birds, which then is the whole food chain that we need to be aware of, because with the way that we are doing things as humans, we are causing serious problems in our ecosystem and in our natural world in general. Also, I've included plants that provide cover, hibernation and nest sites, so dense vegetation or thorns or tree cavities, exfoliating or rough bark. And then woody plants that provide materials for nest building, bark strips, twigs, stems, lichens that might grow on trees, things like that. So the variety of things that I show here, you'll see the birds that are eating various seeds. You'll see the tiger swallowtail caterpillar that's feeding on a leaf. And then, of course, our bumblebees that are working on that wonderful little willow flower there. The hummingbird with the buckeye, the pileated woodpecker that's working on making a nest hole. And then, of course, this cute little fox kit, I should say, at the bottom that can eat a lot of those little nuts and berries and seeds that we'll talk about. So again, a real important part of all of this and the connectivity of it all is the fact that these invertebrates are a very vital part of the food source for many things, in addition to, and certainly the most, is our bird species. And without having those, the high protein content in those caterpillars, it's not like going to eat a seed, because many of these birds that come up here to nest up here, they come up here to get the caterpillars. They don't eat the seeds. That's not the way that they feed. So as we see a decline in our insect species, especially in our caterpillar species, we need to readdress what we're doing and try to find some solutions, because we are causing some serious problems. And then a whole variety of caterpillars are out there, whether they're moth or they're butterfly caterpillars, and at the various stages when they occur and their colorations. This is, again, is all important to the fact that some of them have the strategies for obviously trying to fool a predator. But all in all, it's important to have this, because the actual material that the birds get from these, as far as carbohydrates, proteins, fats, this is all what's very important. So I'm going to start off with spring. And you're going to notice that you'll maybe look at something and say, well, why did you put it in spring? It should go in summer. It's more about the way that I laid it out was what part of that plant is as most usable maybe in a particular season. So we've got the pawpaw trees that bloom in the spring. They have these wonderful little flowers that point downward, because a lot of what pollinates them comes from underneath. Flies and such. There's a question mark butterfly here that's nectaring on this flower. But here's the number that I was talking about in the parentheses, and that's the number of invertebrate species, mainly Lepidoptera species, that actually can use this plant, mainly as a caterpillar source that is feeding on that particular leaf type. So some of our caterpillars are very connected to one particular plant, and some can feed on a number of different plants. And so it's very important that we don't lose any of these species, because if we do, then we lose the caterpillar and everything else that goes along with it. So the American plum, I mean, some of these numbers are very impressive, because like the plums are part of the group with the cherries, things like that. So that's one that's got very high numbers. The tulip tree, we don't normally get to see that flower, because usually it's higher up, because the tree is usually taller, but again, provides nectar and pollen for our insects, as well as the birds that hunt in those flowers to take out some of those small insects as well. Serviceberry there in the lower right. So you can see the spring blooms, and then later we have the fruit. The redbud, again, blooming in the spring, but it's got 19. The flowering dogwood, of course, has a beautiful spring flower color, the brack color. And then when the berries are out, a lot of the birds will come in to eat those berries. So it's a very sought after plant in that regard. We also get sassafras, hawthorns, crab apples, choke cherries. Many other cherries are also blooming at that time, or with the flowers that are out, we get our birds coming back from migration. They start to pick through the flowers to try to get more insect food. So again, think about what you might already have in your yard. Think about how you could add to it. And even if you wanted to try to play the numbers and say, oh, well, these have really high numbers, I'm going to start with them. That's a good way to do it, because you know that then you will be bringing in a lot of these invertebrate species that can help our birds and then indirectly help us. So getting into the shrubs for spring, we've got chokeberries, wafer ash or hop tree, the willows, elderberries, blueberries, all of those all have great benefit. Again, you can see that there are insects that are using these flowers, very important, not only for gaining the nectar that they need as a food source, but also the pollination, which then goes on to make the berries and the fruit of the rest of the cycle that has to proceed onward. Other spring shrubs are shrub dogwoods. So we're talking like gray and silky red osier, a lot in that group. Our spice bush, which most all of you probably know that is our food plant for the spice bush swallowtail. And many of you probably get to see that in the spring when the butterfly hatches out and then comes in to lay her eggs. It's a very interesting looking caterpillar down here in the lower left. Those are not real eye spots. They're just part of the way that they try to fend off a predator. We have the buckeyes, which Ohio buckeye, yellow, red, bottle brush. So there's a whole group in there. And then here's our Baltimore Oriole young male that's feeding, probably gaining little insects out of the buckeye flowers. So again, this is what they do. They don't just go in and try to find a caterpillar. They can also feed on the insects that are in the flowers, whether they're nectaring or pollinating or both. Viburnums here in the upper right, again, those berries can be a very important food source. The flowers are also important for the insects that are attracted to them. Plus the viburnums provide 104 different species that can use the leaves for their food source. And then the roses, and I'm not talking about knockout roses and things like that. I'm talking about prairie rose and swamp rose and our native roses. So I wanted to, a couple of these I've separated out and given a little more information on it. And the willows are one because there's a number of very important items with the willows. Using the native willows as your choice is very important. The pussy willow that you see there on the left, which is Salix discolor, recommended for home habitats because it doesn't, I mean, it can get big, but not as big as some of the other willows get. It's certainly a manageable shrub. It provides not only the nectar and the food source for pollen that the queen bumblebees need because they come out early. And that's what makes willows a very important food source because willows flower very early. The peach leaf willow, which you see on the right, that's a species that would get very large. So some of these things that I've mentioned here, if you have a small garden or a patio garden, some of these things are not going to work. But if you have the room or you have the habitat, I highly recommend adding some willow species in and around your areas because it really does draw in the insects as well as the birds. And then the nesting that goes on in addition to that makes it an all-around really good species to have. There's more than 450 Lepidopteran species that use the willows. The early flowers, like I said, are a boon to the early insects. So if you're an insect that's coming out early in the spring and the weather's getting nice and it's getting nicer earlier, you hatch out and there's no flowers out because they're not out yet, it can be a real problem. You're not going to make it. So willows tend to be a little more of an available food source because they do come out early. So, think about that in your gardening plans or as you plan for this year's work that you might do outside. And again, those pussy willows, they can cut the stems and bring them indoors and they will flower indoor and they will also, most of these will actually root in your vase and you could give it a try and take them out and plant them as like a cutting. And then again, many bird species will use the willows for nesting due to the dense cover that they give. And as the foliage, or if you have a group that are growing together, you get some interesting species in there. So we have our bumblebee on the pussy willow on the left, and then the mourning cloak, which is another one. All of those butterflies that overwinter as butterflies, the mourning cloak, the comments and question marks, a lot of in the angle wing group. When they come out on a nice warm day, they're looking for food. So willows can be the one that really helps them through. Also, weeping willow and corkscrew willows are not native species. So while you might say, oh, I have a willow in my yard, I have a weeping willow. Well, okay, that's very true and that's good. Try to also think about that one of the biggest complaints that people would use with willows is that their roots would always get into their water systems or their sewer systems or whatever. But keep in mind that all trees seek water underground. So it's not just the roots of willows that are doing that, but all the trees are doing that. So just think about that when you think about placement. But more importantly, don't not put in a native willow because you think that that might be an issue. That's really not the issue if you sort of do your homework on it and think about where you want to put them in addition to where you might have other things in your yard. So we have black willow, silky willow, bog willow, which is an endangered species in Ohio, but look at those buds. Those are just absolutely beautiful. Diamond willow, erysicephala. So again, all of these are very useful. The viceroy butterfly caterpillar, you can see that there in the middle. That's one that uses willows to a great extent. And then along the bottom, you'll see this little sequence of the red spotted purple. So when the red spotted purple lays its eggs on a willow leaf, they'll hatch, they start to eat the leaf. But then when they're ready to overwinter, they overwinter as a caterpillar. And what they do is they will take the leaf and they will cut this very odd pattern out of the leaf and they will fold it over their body and stitch it all together. And initially, when they first started to make this little shelter, they took silk from their body and attached this leaf to the stem so that when winter comes, that leaf doesn't drop off. It stays tied to the stem, and you can see it here. Now it's completely finished. And inside of this little hole right here is the little larva or the caterpillar that overwinters as that little caterpillar. It's about, it's pretty tiny at that point. It's like the size of, I don't know, a little bit bigger than a grain of cooked rice. But you can actually look for these on the willows now. If you're in an area where there's some willows, look for this sort of folded up leaf. And if you see that the leaf is sort of stitched with silk to the stem, you may have found yourself a red spotted purple larva. So what happens then in the spring when the new leaves start to emerge, that little caterpillar comes out of its little shelter and it is rewarded by being the first one at the table to eat the nice willow leaves that are very succulent because they're brand new out. So one of the vines for spring is the running strawberry bush. Most people see this in the woods. They don't realize that it maybe is a vine, but it is a woodland species. It gets about a foot high, but then it typically sort of lays over and then continues to grow along the ground. It is a euonymus, so the bloom might look familiar to you if you're familiar with other ones in that genus. The flowers occur at May and June. You can see in this upper picture, they're not very showy. They're a lot like a pale green color. And then when the flower is pollinated and it goes into making its fruit, it has this great little covering over it that's sort of a pale pink, and then the berries inside are a vibrant red. And again, turkey, bobwhite, pheasants will eat that, the cardinals, the robins, the bluebirds. Again, remember, a lot of those birds that leave for the winter leave because their food source are insects, and our insects aren't flying when it's cold and freezing, but they can eat berries and seeds and things like that. So this can be a useful plant for them in the fall, and it makes for a very nice ground cover in your gardens. Okay, let's move into summer. If you're not familiar with what this picture is, take a look. It's just a close-up of a buttonbush flower. And you can see the pollen at the ends there. And then, if you're a butterfly and you've got to get your little proboscis type tongue down into the center to get to the nectar, it's a great way to transfer the pollen onto the bodies of whatever might be crawling across it. So let's go into our summer trees. We have our oaks, black gum, hornbeams, maples, and black walnut. If you look at the number next to the oaks, that's our big guy. That's the number one highest number of what it attracts or what the species can use on it. Now, that picture that you see there is actually the flowers of the oak. They don't look like much, but they are wind driven. So the pollen is blown in the wind. That's why a lot of us have sneezing issues and sort of spring allergy issues, because these trees are in flower. That one in particular, the oak, you can see how as those flowers sort of sway in the breeze, the pollen gets disseminated and off it goes. But once the leaves start to emerge and little insects are actually on those flowers as well, they're looking for food as well. They may not necessarily be pollinating, but they are able to get nectar off of it. The lower left, our black gum, beautiful tree, turns this vibrant red in the fall, has these blueberries that birds and mammals can feed on as well. Our hornbeams, we have our two groups, hop hornbeam and American hornbeam. And you can see the numbers there. Most of you, I'm sure, have seen the bark in the lower picture in the woods that looks kind of like a bicep, very smooth with some lines in it. And then, of course, our maples, another one that's pretty high up there, 297 species. And you can see how when it starts to emerge and or starts to come out, it's got also those type of flowers that'll end up turning into our samaras, which are our little helicopters. And then the black walnut, another one that is also has a good number of species that use it. And a lot of the species that I talk about here today can actually do okay under a black walnut. A lot of people, or I've been asked that question a lot. Well, what can I plant because I have a lot of black walnuts in my yard? Some of these species are actually able to grow and flourish under a black walnut. Okay, so I did a special little page on the oaks. There could be pages and pages and pages that you could do on the oaks. Some of the information here in the center comes from Doug Tallamy's oak book, and I have that listed as a reference and resource at the end of the talk. But the oaks have the highest biodiversity value, meaning that dozens of birds and mammals and insects, reptiles, spiders, the whole bit, all depend on oak leaf litter. Oak leaves make a very good fabric on the forest floor because the leaves don't really mat down. They don't lose them a lot of times until later. A single oak can produce up to 3 million acorns in its lifetime, and a single blue jay can plant more than 3,300 oak trees each year. They typically will carry an acorn like a mile away from where they picked it up. If they think that another jay or another species that might take its acorn saw it when it was planting it, it will dig it back up and take it someplace else. They're quite crafty about that. More than 550 Lepidopteran species use oak. And then we here in Ohio, we have the white oak group and the red oak group. So the red oaks have the pointy leaf edges like you see in the pin oak up on the upper left. And the white oaks have the rounded leaf edges like a bur oak that you see in the lower right. And then because the oaks are so incredibly important in our ecosystem, see if you can plant at least one oak in your garden habitat. Even if you have, a smaller yard, you can actually prune back oaks to keep them small. There's a lot of good information out there to do that, but you will be rewarded with species that, if they come in and they lay their eggs on your oaks and you pay attention to them, you might find those caterpillars. And of course, as the oaks grow large, they're a nice sturdy tree for our raptors to nest. The bottom shows a red-shouldered hawk in an oak tree nest. But again, so many species use oaks that we need to provide more trees for them. The buds are very different in oaks. They're clustered at the tips like you see there. That's the bud arrangement for a black oak. Okay, getting into our summer trees then, the American beech on the left, and I know everybody's going to say, well, why should we, pay attention to the beech trees because they have the beech leaf disease, but keep in mind that while they do have the beech leaf disease, they do have other diseases as well, but they're still an incredibly useful tree, a lot of habitat in their cavities. You can see a screech owl here in one of the openings in the trunk. The seeds that you see here at the bottom, this will open up in a little sort of a triangular shaped seed will come out of there. A lot of birds and mammals eat those seeds. Foxes can eat them as well. So, don't rule them out just yet. It's an important tree because there are a lot of LEP species that use it, 127 species. And then the next section here to the right are the hickories. So because there's a number of hickories within that genus, shagbark, pignut, all kinds, shellbark, their numbers are nice and high too at 235, but they turn a nice, most of them all turn a nice yellow in the fall. When they emerge, they've got, especially the shagbark has a huge terminal bud. And that's because when that bud opens, that whole arrangement of leaves will come out of there, and you can see that one's just emerging now. And then they also get nice cavities in them. I've seen plenty of honeybee hives using cavities in hickory trees and other trees as well, but this one in particular was humming with quite a lot of activity in the spring one year. And then this little leaf scar, if you're not familiar with a leaf scar, so where the leaf attaches, or the stem of the leaf attaches to the actual stem of the tree, most of these have very distinctive leaf scars, and the shellbark has this very, pink heart-shaped leaf scar, very, very distinctive. Okay, getting into some of our summer shrubs, we have buttonbush, bottlebrush buckeye, clethra, New Jersey tea, and the spireas, just, to name a few. There are others. The buttonbush, when it's in bloom, it is a magnet for pollinating and nectaring insects, bees, butterflies, moths, the whole bit. A lot of things visit it. You don't necessarily have to have water in order to plant and grow a buttonbush successfully. It really does have a wide variety. And if you're a photographer, for example, and you like to take pictures of butterflies or other little insect type creatures, a buttonbush is a really great one to have, because you can stand there and watch them, and they will come right there and feed. So it's a very useful plant for that sort of thing. The bottlebrush buckeye, it is a buckeye. It's in that group of buckeyes, but its flower looks considerably different than what you might think of a regular buckeye. But it does get an awful lot of insects, especially carpenter bees, bumblebees, some of the smaller bees. It's got that little throat to the flower, so I get hummingbirds on mine as well. So, one to watch, one to think about. It is one of the buckeyes that actually can do well in the woods or in a forest type setting, a shady area. Does just fine there. Clethra or summer sweet is a shrub that once you've planted it, make sure you plant in an area where you've got room, because it will grow outwardly and it'll send up they're like suckers, but they keep moving outward and send up new shoots. But when it's in bloom, a lot of bees, some of our smaller native bees, visit it as well. New Jersey tea is one of my favorites, just because it starts off kind of small when you first plant it, but it can get to be a fair size. It's not a huge shrub, but 2 feet tall or so. But a lot of the little flies will visit it. You get some really interesting flower flies, and you get some good looks at some of our other small native bees. The spireas, which are the two that are here on the right, the pink and the white. Typically, you'll see these in areas that might be, say, around a pond or near the edges of wetlands, things like that, but they grow fine in a regular habitat, a garden type habitat. So something to think about. And again, keep in mind that when you look for these, and for those of you that might have attended the talks earlier today, there was a couple of good talks on how difficult it is to find native species. So if all of us get out there and request it and try to find nurseries that have it, maybe more of these nurseries will carry these things. And for one of the summer vines, I put in the trumpet honeysuckle vine. Again, this is one that's a little more to the south of us, but I've had mine for years and it does just fine up here. Think hummingbirds, think a lot of the sphinx moths, or the clearwing moths, the hummingbird clearwing, the snowberry clearwing. That's the little sections in the middle here. This is a snowberry clearwing. It is a moth. There's the caterpillar on the left. Uses this plant among others as well, but a very interesting looking caterpillar. And again, actually a very beautiful moth. It flowers from May to June, and it's got these beautiful tubular flowers. The hummingbirds like it, the bees like it, the butterflies like it. And then it produces these small red berries in the late summer. The thrushes, finches, bob whites. And I say bob whites because, back in the day before we lost them, bob whites were a bird that would come around to areas, especially meadow type areas where there was cover, but they could feed on a lot of these berries. Also, and I've seen this actually on mine where I've had my Baltimore Orioles try to anchor itself on one of the branches and then try to get in and seek nectar out of those long tubular flowers. So if you're a fan of the Baltimore Oriole, that's one that you may want to consider. Another summer vine that I want to mention, or another vine I want to mention, are the grapevines. And there's sort of two camps on the grapevines as far as liking or not liking. If you like wine, well, there you go. But for your home habitat, think of it in terms of all the different species that can use this, and they use like all parts of it. So for example, it uses a tree or a support to climb vertically. It is not a constricting vine, which means it doesn't wrap and spiral around the trunk like bittersweet and some of the other vines do, but it uses the tree as a support as it grows upward to reach the light. So it can be in a variety of habitats, sun or shade. What's really important, and the upper left picture shows it, is if you are a nesting bird here in Northeast Ohio in the spring and summer, I think it's something almost like 90% of those birds in some way use these little strips off of the grapevine vine as their initial support for their nest. And as they add more material to it, the spider webs to hold stuff together, grasses might be on the inside. But in doing that, that makes a very, very important building material for your nesting birds. If they have to fly a long way away to find their materials, they're just going to go nest closer to where the materials are found. So if you've got the room or the ability to grow grapevines, even if you grow them on a trellis and you keep them, cut back or compact, the birds can still use those thin strips off of the vine. Also keep in mind that when it does produce the grapes, and there are, a number of species of native grapevine, that whether the birds eat them when they're ripe or whether they eat them later in the winter, those of you that do Christmas bird counts or get into that sort of thing, we always find that we get our greatest number of species in areas where there are grapevines remaining, because there's usually fruit that might be dried up but's left on the vine or below it. And that's a very important food source in the winter when there's not a whole lot of things for the birds who remain here to eat. Here again, when you get a good, robust grapevine tangle, that's where a lot of times you'll find the larger owls, barred owls, in particular, though, the great horned owl. And this is what's hiding here behind this grapevine tangle here. And the reason is because that there's a lot of birds that once they see an owl, they will mob it or make a bunch of noise and try to scare it away. So if they are in a grapevine tangle where they're not as noticeable, then they can pass the day roosting without something, or some of the birds, the crows, the blue jays, trying to chase them away. Also, at this time of year and into the fall, you'll find these great little kinglets, golden crowned kinglet, that will just go all over the grapevines looking for either, leftover pieces of the fruit or dried pieces of the fruit, but the bugs that also get in and around the grapevine complex. Down here, you can see the flowers. They're not very noticeable, but they do attract, flies and bees and other insects to use them. And then these two little moths that I have here, the one on the right is the lesser grapevine looper, and the one on the left is the grapevine epimenis, but both of those lay their eggs on grapevines, so their caterpillars can use that food as well. And then let's move into the fall. again, our fall trees, and again, these trees are going to be out in all the seasons, but just placing them in different areas for what might be useful. The persimmon. This is one of our native trees and it does produce fruit, and they're little persimmons, not like what you would get in a warmer climate, but they're good. And especially after first couple of frosts, they get even sweeter. The chickadees, the robins, any of the thrushes that remain, when the fruit is available, they will get up top there. As you can see in the photo, all those little blobs that you see on the tree, those are all persimmons. And they will pick through there. The chickadee will peel off the little tougher outer skin to it and feed on it. The flower, you can see here in the center, is sort of a cream colored flower. But again, and the leaves, hang down like that, they're a little bit shiny on their surface, but it is a great tree and it's a very interesting tree to watch as it goes through the seasons to see the bugs that are attracted to the flowers and then the birds that are attracted to the fruit. And then the witch hazels. So we have witch hazels that bloom in the fall, which is very important. So for example, some of our last remaining insects that are still out as it starts to get cold and the photo period changes and there's less daylight length, witch hazels blooming provide a nectar source and a pollen source for some of those late insects. They'll hold their flowers, those look sort of spidery looking leaves to them. But we also have witch hazels that bloom in the spring. So that's a different species. But again, this is a shrub that you could certainly grow. It typically likes to be around a little bit more of a moister habitat. But if you pay attention to it, you can get it to grow and it'll do okay. And it'll also, a lot of times you'll find it as an understory in the woods. And that's typically where people see the bigger ones walking through a woodland or along a stream corridor. It's very, very pretty. Some other shrubs to consider are the sumacs. Now, I'm not suggesting that you all go out and put poison sumac in your yard, which is probably wouldn't live anyway. It's a bog or a fen species. So it needs a very specific habitat in order to do well. But the other sumacs, winged sumac, staghorn sumac, which is the one that you see here with the sort of red, sort of coxcomb looking fruit to it. There's also aromatic sumac, which has become a preferred plant by landscapers to put in parking lots, in little islands of things, because it can tolerate salt and things like that, and it's low growing and the foliage is very aromatic. But again, some of these other ones like the staghorn, a lot of the birds that remain here through the winter will use those berries. They're like a very fuzzy berry, and they have you can actually eat them too. You can boil them up and you can pour the fluid in an ice cube tray and make ice cubes out of it, because it has like a citrus flavor to it. There's the pileated woodpecker dining on it. Also the bluebirds, the robins, again, any of the other thrush species that happen to stay, they will use it too. Here's our flower cluster. This is a winged sumac, different species within that group. But again, when those flowers open, they're very tiny. So the tiny little bees and the tiny little flies that get in there and nectar from them or pollinate them are just glorious. You just have to get really close and try to, get in there. For example, if you're trying to photograph them, they're very small. So, but it's a good food source for them. Plus they turn a beautiful, brilliant scarlet red in the fall. The thing though to be aware of is the fact that they do colonize. They'll make a fair sized colony. So don't necessarily plant them in an area where you have a very small little plot or not much room. And then our winterberry, which is an ilex, which is like a deciduous holly. The flowers you'll find them along the stems. I've shown mainly the berries here because that's what really brings in the birds once the winterberry goes to berry. One of the questions I get asked probably the most often in this group is, I've got winterberry and they have berries, and it's now January and the berries are still on the tree or the shrub. Why aren't the birds eating them? And there could be a number of reasons for that. Number one, the birds don't eat them early until usually after a couple of frosts have occurred. And as they talked about earlier today with cultivars and things of plants, we do have a lot of experimentation going on where they might make a species shorter or taller or a different color in order to please the humans. But keep in mind that a lot of these things that we're growing, we should be growing them to please the birds or to please other wildlife, because we need that wildlife to be successful for our own good as well. So again, there could be a number of reasons. They may not be fully mature at the time that the birds are looking for them. And then you may find that some shrubs, the birds come and totally take all the berries off, and some others they don't. And you might want to think about, were they a cultivar when you purchased them? And that might have something to do with it as well. For another vine in the fall, I chose the Virginia creeper. And again, this is one that hopefully you'll be able to tell the difference between a Virginia creeper and a poison ivy, but it's got great blueberries on it. It can climb, or you can use it as a ground cover. And I've actually done that, and it's been a very successful experimentation. I just, every time that it tries to climb up a tree or a shrub, I just lay the little arms down on the ground to keep it. It keeps its vegetation cover for a long time. When fall comes around, it turns that nice scarlet red that you see there. And if you see where this great little sapsucker is here on this side, you can see that these are the stems of what it looks like when it's climbing up the tree. They have little tendrils that, I shouldn't say tendrils, but there are tendrils with discs. So that's how they can attach without destroying what they are attaching themselves to. The flowers are kind of nondescript. They're sort of a greenish flower, but they do attract bees and flies and some other pollinators or some other nectar-seeking insects. The leafcutter bees will use leaflets in constructing their larval nests. So you might see leaves that have little sort of C-shaped chew marks out of it. And keep in mind that when you have some of your plants and they're a non-native species, you're not going to see a whole bunch of little chew holes and things like that in them, because our native species can't use them. They didn't evolve with them. They don't necessarily have the right mouth parts to chew through some of the vigorous leaf structure that they have. So when you're seeing little marks in your leaves, then you know that, probably a native insect is using that for something. And of course, there could be some non-native insects as well, but think about that you're seeing signs of insects that are using those plants. So the berries that are produced on the Virginia creeper, they're dark blue and they're small, but a lot of our little mammals can eat them. A lot of the birds that stay here through the winter can eat them. And then also birds are still migrating at the time those berries have occurred or are occurring. Excuse me. So you might see some of the migrating birds feasting on the vines as they make their way south. More than 35 species of birds are reported to eat the fruit. And there's that little caterpillar that you see down there at the bottom is the Pandora Sphinx caterpillar. And you can find that, feeding on it in the fall as well. The berries are poisonous for people, but again, we don't need to be out there eating them, save them for the birds. And let's move into winter. Again, I've put some things here. Our eastern hemlock on the left with that great white-winged crossbill. If you're not familiar with the crossbill, its bill actually crosses over itself. It doesn't open and close like a typical bird bill at the end, so that it can get into those little cones and it can separate the cones in order to get the seeds out of the cones. Now, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the hemlock woolly adelgid that has decimated many, if not all, of the hemlocks in the Smokies, but we do have some cases that have cropped up here in Northeast Ohio. But that shouldn't, keep you from keeping an eye on your hemlocks, looking for that species anyway, the hemlock woolly adelgid. But more importantly, that we have some great mature hemlocks in Northeast Ohio, typically in woodland areas that might have stream corridors, or they would be near some fen or bog habitats along the edges, things like that. But it's a very useful bird, very useful tree for a lot of bird species and insect species as well. It's cover. Also in a woodland, it provides shade to the forest floor, which is very important to all the great creatures that are living in the soil layer that don't need to be heated up when we potentially lose the forest cover. The birches, and there's a whole group, that's another one that's got that collective of plants in the birch family, has a lot of attractiveness to the insects and the birds as well. 411 species use that. At the bottom, you'll see the red poles on the ground. As they are up in the trees, like in the winter, they'll go and pull the little seeds off of the catkins, and as they fall to the ground in the snow, they'll just work over all those little spots that you see there are all potential birch seeds that they can feed on. And then our pines to the right, that's a eastern white pine at the top, 201 species that use it. I put these little caterpillars here so that you could see how they take basically one little piece at a time. That's the imperial moth caterpillar on the right. And then the one on the left, I don't know because it was just so immature or so small. I don't know the species on that. But again, as you have your pines growing together, they provide a lot of cover. Back to our owls again and other birds. This could be a place where you have a good grouping of pines. It can be a nesting habitat for Cooper's hawks or sharp-shinned hawks, of course, the owls. And if the trees are larger, then you may find that some of the other hawks as well might use a nice mature pine tree. Also, long-eared owls will use them as well. And another grouping that I classified or put under the winter section, sweet gums, mainly because of the seeds and the little balls, the sweet gum balls that you see there. If you are a bird watcher, you would like to have these when the siskins are out. They also can take their bills within the holes of the actual ball and pry it open. In this little shot on the left here, you can see how tiny the seeds are, because here's the edge of the seed ball here. I just opened it up so that you could see how small they were. But other species like the Luna moth lay its eggs on sweet gum and feed off of those as well. And it's another one that turns a beautiful scarlet in the fall. So if you're a fan of really beautiful leaf changing colors matched with other really beautiful leaf changing colors, the sweet gum is right up there. The holly that you see up at the top, that's also an ilex in the same group like the winterberry that we saw, only this actually stays evergreen. 39 species on that, but if you have hollies, then you have the male and the female. If you have the ability to take a look at those flowers when they open, it's amazing how many of the tiny little iridescent bees will visit those flowers. Again, something that if you like to photograph them or you like to look at them through your binoculars, this is a good plant to watch them, because they very carefully go from flower to flower and get what they can get out of it. The lower two pictures are of the eastern red cedar. Again, that I put in because those are called soft cones. They're not really a berry, but they are another bird magnet. There's a northern mockingbird down there feeding on the fruit. But you might have cedars that have berries, and you might have cedars that don't have berries. And again, it's part of that male-female thing where you'll have some on, but you need to have them so that they can pollinate in order to produce the fruit. But you do get a lot of good birds, and especially if they are out and ready to go as birds are migrating, you will see visitors stop by and feed on those as well. And then my last vine of the vine group, I did include the poison ivy vine because it really does provide a lot of important nutrition. Basically, humans are the only ones that get the rash or get a reaction to it. So if you are allergic to it, you just need to know what to do and to stay away from it. But if you can have poison ivy growing away from where you might frequent, you will be stunned at the amount of birds that'll come in the wintertime to feed on the berries. Warbler, yellow rump warblers, the woodpeckers, the chickadees, the bluebirds, at least 60 species of birds are reported to eat the fruit. It can pretty much grow anywhere. If you happen to get it in your lawn and you keep mowing it, that should take care of it. But you could see it growing through fields. You can see it growing in woodlands, and it can, the height of it is basically dependent on what it's climbing on or what it's using as its structure to climb upward. It flowers from April to July. These little small clusters, again, not real big or showy flowers. You can see the buds down here in the lower right, and they're on stalks like that. The stems have these aerial roots which cling along, help it to cling on the vertical surface, but you can also, if you rub against those, you can get your reaction if you're allergic as well. The leaves turn another one that turns really nice, brilliant red in the fall. And that's sort of a signpost to the birds, because many of the vines, especially the creeper, the Virginia creeper and the poison ivy, their leaves, turn red or orange in the fall. And that is an attracting notation to the bird that they need to go find the berries that are on those vines. So that red is an indication for them as they're perusing for food and checking out different areas. Deer and other mammals can eat the foliage as well as the berries. And then again, with all the different species of birds that visit it, you can watch a pileated woodpecker and other birds get very creative for how they reach out to grab those berries. That lower left shot shows you how that pileated woodpecker is basically hanging as far back as he can to get that, to get that little berry. But if you are a birder and you know of areas that have a lot of poison ivy, then that's the place to go to do your bird watching, because it's amazing what that will bring in. And again, you could see here, so the tree, the photo on the left, you could see the tree trunk is here, but all of the things growing up the tree trunk is the poison ivy vine. And then the vine then sends out these stems that go out to the sides, and you can see how there's berries on that. But you can see how the flickers and the pileated, they're all feeding on that. And the weight of the bird, actually can pull that vine down. Here's a red-bellied woodpecker on the right feeding on it as well. And then now I picked some species here that were a little bit different. For those of you that know the Monty Python skits of Now and Now for Something Completely Different, I've picked these three here in the tree group: the tamarack, the Ben Franklin or Franklinia tree, and the striped maple. The tamarack tree, typically you see it in a bog or a fen habitat, but you can certainly grow it in your yard. It doesn't necessarily have to be wet. It turns a really beautiful yellow in the fall. Here's what it's a deciduous evergreen. Unfortunately, some people that aren't familiar with it, when it loses its needles and it just looks like a regular tree in the winter, deciduous tree in the winter, some people go in and cut it down thinking that it has died. Well, it hasn't. It'll produce needles again, and you can see that here. If you're in the area and you want to see what a tamarack looks like, you could go to places like Kent Bog, Fern Lake Bog, some of the other DNAP sites that have protected areas that where the tamarack grow. The middle group shows the Franklinia tree. This is one that I have several in my yard, mainly because it is an absolute bumblebee, carpenter bee magnet. The blooms are big, can support several bees at one time. The little sweat bees and those of that group will also go in there to try to nectar on it as well. It's another one that turns a very vibrant red. It is typically an understory tree. It was sort of discovered in the, I believe in the Southern Smoky Mountains back in the day. And so now they might be a little hard to find, but just make sure it's watered well enough when you first plant it, but it's really a great tree. It doesn't get very tall. I think the tallest one that I have, and I've had it for probably close to 10 years, is about 25 feet or 30 feet tall. But again, if it's out in the sun more, it's going to have more vibrant color and more blooms. And then on the right here, you see the striped maple. This is a native tree in Ohio. Typically, we only see it up in the far reaches of Ashtabula County, but there are other areas where it grows, Western Pennsylvania, New York, and that. Again, it's got this great striped bark. The leaf, you can see how it looks like a maple leaf, but something important to remember about it, it is an understory tree, so it should be in a woodland area or a shady area, but it does not do well if it were to dry out. So just make sure that if you try to find it and plant it, it turns a beautiful yellow in the fall, but it's just a nice, little tree or understory tree that the leaves can get quite large on them as well. But just a really cool one to think about. In the shrub group, I've chosen prickly ash, beautyberry, and American blatternut, and mainly for what it does in the attractive sense to the wildlife and the nature and the insects and all that. So prickly ash is not an ash that's going to be bothered by the emerald ash borer because it's one of what we call a citrus ash. So it has fragrance to it, but it does have little thorns on the stems that you can see here. Here's where it first starts to come out in the spring. Here's what the fruit looks like in the fall. Again, this is a plant that is the food plant for the giant swallowtail. So if you're a fan of that butterfly, this might be one to plant. And if you get a nice collection of them together, you find quite a few birds will nest in there because the stems have the little thorns on them, and it grows together enough to make a nice protective area inside of it. The beautyberry, Calicarpa, that's one that we're seeing more and more now in the trade to where they're showing it. There is an American beautyberry, and then there are other non-native beautyberries. So be sure to look for the native one. And again, in the fall, when it's got these very interesting lavender purplish berries, the birds do eat them. And the blooms do attract small insects when they are in bloom. But if you have it, or you have found it, or you have seen a nice mature specimen, it's very, very attractive. And again, it is native. It's native to the Midwest and more toward the southern part of the United States, but it has actually made its way up here and thrives okay without being a problem. So that might be one that catches your attention, but again, you get birds feeding on those berries as well. And then the American blatternut. This is one that typically is a woodland species. It's not as attractive. You're not going to see it as a shrub, and you're going to stop and say, oh, that's really a cool shrub, because when it's in leaf and it's just like in the summertime, it doesn't look like much. But boy, when the flowers are in bloom, it really attracts a lot of leps, adult butterflies and moths and tiny little bees. You can see the flowers point downward like this. So the butterflies have to get their tongue up inside there to get to the nectar. Again, though, it also is a plant or a shrub that you'll find along a stream corridor or river corridor, but that doesn't mean it needs to be wet. It can grow in upland areas as well. But again, if it's more in the shade, it's not going to flower as much than if it has obviously some sun during the day. And then for the vines, I've picked a couple here. So the pipe vine, or the Dutchman's pipe, is one that years ago our butterfly group got together and we purchased some of these in order to attract the pipe vine swallowtail. And we do have a native pipe vine, or a native Aristolochia in Ohio that is one that is more found in the southern part of the state because it's not as hardy up here. It's called the Virginia snakeroot, Aristolochia serpentaria. But the bloom on this plant, on the macrophylla, kind of looks like those old Dutchman pipe type arrangement. And again, it can be very vigorous and it can spread underground. So don't put it in an area where it doesn't have a lot of room to roam. Back in the day, prior to air conditioning coming onto the scene, a lot of people would plant this vine along the edges or the sides of their porches to provide shade so that they could keep cooler in the summer. And then the purple passion flower vine, and I'm going to show you a little video on this here in a second, but this flower obviously looks very tropical. This is a native, more toward the southern part of the United States. However, it has made its way up north and it does fine up here. I've had several for years. Just make sure if you're going to try it to put it someplace where it might be out of the wind, like the east side of your house or structure or whatever. And then the other thing is as it starts to grow, it can be aggressive. I don't know that I would use aggressive as a word, but it can cover the area that it is growing, and then it totally, dies back in the winter. But make sure that you have it in a place where you can either grow up a trellis and to keep it away from just covering what else you might have underneath it. And then the native honeysuckle on the right is Lonicera dioica. It's got this arrangement where the flowers will open and it'll have that tubular flower like other honeysuckles, but this is a native to Ohio. Again, it's one that's typically found more in a sort of a shady or part sun, part shade habitat, but it does very well. It works well up here because it's from here. And then here's the pipe vine that I talked about. Obviously the vine on the left, but this is the butterfly. This is a male. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's more of a southern species, mainly because the native plant that grows down there, that Virginia snakeroot, does very well down there. And hence the butterfly is more numerous down there. But the caterpillars, you can see on the right, the brown, sort of the Cleveland Browns colors on their coloration. And they can eat the leaves, they can eat the stems. When the female comes to lay the eggs, she'll usually lay them in a couple of, clusters where they might have 2 or 3 or 4 eggs in this little group, and then she'll go to another leaf on the vine, usually a newer one or a fresher one to lay her eggs, but another just beautiful butterfly. And then here's that passion vine that I mentioned. So if you look at the upper right photo, you see that, so the anthers are marked by the yellow arrow. And if I'm going to circle it here, this is the anther here. And then you could see it over here as well. But the anthers are the male organs which produce the pollen, and they point downward. When they first open, they actually point upward, but then as they mature a little bit or get a little bit older, they'll point downward, and they pivot on a stalk, and they deposit their pollen across the top of the bee as the bee is trying to obtain the nectar. Now, for the bee to obtain the nectar, it gets into this center part where you see that sort of a maroon color, where these fibers are, and that's the operculum. And as they dig into those fibers to extract the nectar, they brush up against those anthers, which then places this dusting of pollen along the top of their thorax. And then, of course, the more visits made by the bees to obtain the nectar, the pollen gets worn off of this. So here, let me play this video for you. Why aren't you? There we go. Oh, there we go. So you can see how the anther pivots as the bee rubs up against it. And then the bee uses its legs and its mouth parts to extract the nectar from that operculum area. It's just really cool. And then this next one, then, let me show you. So this one is sort of a top view of it, and you can see the nectar here. This is also a video, but what I want you to look at is on the legs of the bee, you can see these little yellow sort of sac-looking things. Those are pollinia, which tells you that this bee has also visited a milkweed flower. And the hairs on the legs have picked up the pollinia from the milkweed. And if they were to fly to another flower of the milkweed and everything was oriented in the proper fashion, that pollinia then is part of the pollinating process of how milkweed flowers get pollinated. But let me play this video for you. And you can see how, again, as it rubs on that area, look at all the pollen that's at the top of that carpenter bee's thorax. So just a cool little view of that. But, you know, something that if you plant the vine, you might have the ability to watch this happen. So some other habitat things you can do: consider changing your current mowed grass lawn to a no-mow lawn. Reduce and replace grass-only lawns with pollinator and eco-friendly landscaping choices. You don't need all that money in maintenance to the lawns, the time, your gas, watering, and all that, mainly because the lawns provide very little useful habitat for all of our important insects. There's just nothing that they can do anything with. And then, of course, most people then put herbicides and fertilizers and other chemicals, which then also kill the insects that may be in and around those areas as well. Enters our groundwater supplies, and it's just a vicious cycle. So, you know, try to get away from that. Even if you convert a little bit of lawn each year, and I'll give you some sources here at the end of some things you can do. You can use rocks, clovers, herbs, mosses, things like that, because you're also then setting up potential areas where some of our nesting, our small nesting bees can use those sites, or in between the crevices of rocks, things like that. So try to set up your habitat as if you were a native insect, and how can you make the best home for them. Also in the fall, leave the leaves. Avoid removing your fall leaves from your garden habitat for a number of reasons. Many insects, butterflies and moths included, will lay eggs, hide as caterpillars, or hide as caterpillars or pupa in the leaf litter, or in the bark pieces that might be in there as well. And that's how they'll spend the winter. So there's a tiger swallowtail chrysalis here that was in the leaf litter up against a log. Our woolly bear caterpillars will go in and find those areas and remain in the leaf litter, as well as many other moth and butterfly species. The lower picture shows you the great spangled fritillary caterpillar, which is one that you'll find usually in and amongst the violets because that's their food source, but they overwinter as a caterpillar. So something to be aware of. Also, the leaf litter and the leaves, if they're removed, that destroys that life stage of the insects, which is critical then to the birds and other creatures that might feed on them, and also the diversity within your yard or your garden area. Also, the leaves make, they will decompose in time and help make the soils richer in nutrients, organic nutrients. They also help to insulate roots, bulbs, and other underground plant structures. The birds can use leaf pieces for nest building in the spring and early summer. And if necessary, if you're one of those people that, are sort of neat and don't like to see this leaves hanging around, then maybe rake them and leave them in areas where they might not be as annoying to you under shrubs or along a fence edge or just in other out of the way areas. So some of the resources, not only that I have and I enjoy and that I've used for this talk and others, the Midwest Native Shrub and Tree series by Charlotte Adelman and Bernard Schwartz, those two top books, both have a good amount of knowledge that they have disseminated through the fact that this talks about trees, shrubs, perennials, all types of plants that are native and can be used by our species that are native. The middle set, the Xerxes Society Attracting Native Pollinators, that's a very good book as well. The one on the right in the middle here, this Planting Native to Attract Birds to Your Yard, that's a really good guide because it really gives you a lot of good information that is geared toward attracting the birds. So it's berries and seeds and all kinds of things. And then the two books along the bottom, The Pollinators of Native Plants and 100 Plants to Feed the Bees. Again, all of these books and all of this information can be very helpful if you want to sort of convert other areas of your yard or you want to enhance what you've already done. The new book out by Doug Tallamy on the nature of oaks is excellent. If you haven't taken the time to check it out, please do so. A lot of the information on oaks and the study that he and his team have done really makes a difference for how people should view oaks and the importance to our insects and our other invertebrates. And then Joan Maloof, The Teaching of Trees. This is a really good book because it has a different way of looking at trees in the forest and the connectivity of everything. Just an interesting read. And then the other two books, Heather Holm, another book with Heather Holm on the bees, again, gives great information on the plants, what the bees can use, what parts of it they use. Very, very good. And then the bottom one, the Attracting the Beneficial Bugs, that is coming out with a new edition that will be out on February 1st. So you might want to look for that. And then a number of online resources. Eco Beneficial has a lot of good information. There's a good interview on there with Doug Tallamy if you're interested. Also, the Lawn Reform Coalition and the No-Mow Yards. That's becoming more and more popular. They've even gotten to the point where they're doing a no-mow May. So basically what you can learn by this is if you mow every week, then you are potentially mowing down a lot of the species that you're trying to attract. If you mow every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, then you have increased your insect diversity by a fantastic percentage because you're not chopping all the heads off of things like dandelions and clovers and things that, you know, some of these, even though that they're not native plants, they can be in our yard and they are very much desired by a lot of our nectaring and pollinating insects. Again, product sources and nursery information, OPN Seed, which was formerly Ohio Prairie Nursery. Get with them. They know their stuff. They have great native seed mixes. Same with Prairie Moon. And then the wild ones, join a chapter. They're very good. They have a lot of good information. They've got a lot of good staff that know their stuff. And then for those of you that might be in the Northeast Ohio area, but it has a much far more reaching grasp, is the LEAP group, the Lake Erie Allegheny Partnership. They've got a great website. And one of the items on their website is a really good interactive map that shows the native plant or the nurseries in the area that carry native plants. And you click on the little dot and it gives you the name of the locate and the name and the location. And so that might be something you find useful when you're looking for more stock. And then again, I've put our green lacewing at the top and the dandelion in particular at the bottom, because again, dandelions open early. They've got nectar, they've got pollen, and when some of our early emerging insects are out and there's nothing else for them to eat, rather be having them feeding on a dandelion than not surviving. So think about that as well. And the whole group of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, another group that has a lot of good information online and that you can access. And again, I've put 2 shots here showing the pink clover, because being a clover, not only does it add nitrogen and such to the soil, but a lot of our insects find it very, very attractive, both butterflies, bees, many other bugs that you might have visiting in your yard will visit even more. And again, the more that you have is in terms of species of plants, the more insects you will bring in, which then brings in more birds, which then, it's just the whole life cycle of everything, and then the whole food web, basically. So diversity is key, because remember that not all insects can feed or nectar on the same plants, and time of year has a lot to do with who can nectar and feed on what. Typically, if a plant is blooming at a certain time, especially our spring ephemerals, it's mainly because the insects that can help to pollinate those are out at that time of year. So make your planting range run from the earliest of spring all the way into the latest of fall, so that you can attract the most species. And there you go with our bluebird eating one of Lisa Rainsong's katydids. And now I'm ready for questions.
All righty. Well, thank you so much, Judy. That was fantastic. If you check out the chat bots, there's a lot of great messages of people saying thank you. So make sure to check that out. Yeah, I saw some comments, and me myself, I agree with some of the comments. I'll never look at poison ivy and grapevine and that sort of thing the same. I think it's important to remember that no matter where you are in your journey of creating a better habitat for pollinators, they're smart. They can use some of the things that maybe aren't as beneficial, and they can find use in things that we might not see as useful. I know like poison ivy, people despise it, but it has its uses, I guess. But anyway, we did go a little bit over time, and
sorry about that.
I'm definitely not complaining. I don't think anyone else here is complaining. It was a lot of great information, and we're very, very happy to have you. There are some questions in the chat bots. I don't really think we have much time to do questions. If you want to answer 1 or 2, then that's fine. But I apologize to everybody. We probably won't get to your question tonight.
Well, the other thing too, I have put my email on this slide. So
yes,
if you had questions and we can't get to them, please consider sending me a note and sending me your question, and I will do my best to answer them. Because I know we sort of run out of time, and I don't want anybody to miss anything. So you can consider doing that as well.
Well, we appreciate that so much, Judy. And if you do have questions after tonight, specific questions, maybe about what's best for your area, a great resource is your local Master Gardener group. So if you don't know where to contact your local Master Gardener group, Google your county and Master Gardeners, and you should be able to figure it out there, or you can just send me an email and I can help answer questions as well. So we appreciate everybody joining us. Again, this will be recorded, and it will be up. I'll send you some information on that later. Please make sure to join us in 2 weeks for our next presentation. It's going to be just as excellent as this one, and we have 3 more after that. So this is just kicking it off. Looking at my list, making sure I'm getting all my points. Oh, I hinted at the beginning, June 25th, we will have a in-person pollinator symposium. It's in the works. We're planning it right now, June 25th, here in Asheville County. Get that on your calendar. More details to come. We're just teasing it right now. But by the end of this presentation, we'll have information, or the end of the series, we'll have some information about that in-person program. So you're not going to want to miss it. So thank you everybody for joining. Judy, I don't know if you went through the Q&A and saw anything that you wanted to address.
Let's see. Okay.
Someone asked about Nature Spark and the services you offer.
Yes. So for Nature Spark, I lead hikes. I do property surveys, biological inventories, programs like this. A lot of the same sorts of things that I did when I was in the Natural Areas Division at the museum, mainly because I'm very interested in helping people learn about the right things to do. People would like to do the right things if they just know what it is that they can do. And I like to also work with educating kids and getting people actually out in nature. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, again, you can email me to the address there. I do have a website. It's in its infancy, but it is up. And so I can provide that information as well. But again, part of this is all about trying to help people to learn about things in nature that they may not think about in time, and now that they see things, it's like, oh, okay, that's a different way of looking at things. So even if this keeps someone from spraying their yard to get rid of the dandelions, then it works. So I'm just looking through here to see if there's some other questions I can hit real quick. Other suggestions on, the purple passion flower, that it does produce a fruit that's round and green, and it is its own little passion fruit, but that may not be the one that you're thinking of if you're thinking of the tropical type passion fruit. And then conifers native to Ohio. Let's see. I live in Southwest. Some of the other evergreens, yeah. So yes, red cedars are typically the one that you will get there, but all of the other, the pine, the white pine, any of those are all native to your area as well. I'm sure that you have some nurseries down in Southwest Ohio that can help if some of the other things don't do well in your soil and that. I know it's down in that area, sometimes it can be a little more basic soil. So sometimes that can be an issue. But yeah, the cedars are the ones that do really well down there. And in fact, that's when you're looking for saw-whet owls down in Southwest Ohio, that's where people go to look for them, are in the eastern red cedars. So will this record, Andrew, the questions in the chat that I could see them at another time to answer them?
I'll try to work on that, Judy. And again, thank you for answering some questions. Yeah, if you do have a question, feel free to email Judy or your local master gardener. We appreciate you joining us tonight, and hopefully you weren't too overwhelmed by all the pollinator programs going on, but we love to see more education on the subject. So I really enjoyed the presentation, Judy. Thank you for
thank you.
Joining us.
Thank you everyone for joining tonight. And like I said, I'd be happy to attack any of these other questions that we can get to.
Awesome. All right. Well, we'll see everybody in 2 weeks. Make sure have it on your calendar. And as always, these will be recorded. So
thank you.
Thank you for joining us, and we will see you all in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye.